I'm here with Dr. Charles S. Finch. My name is Rabia Lewis, and we'll be doing tonight's presentation on Ethiopian queens.
The great Ethiopian queen.
The great. All right, we're going to pretty much just jump right in. I'll just give a little background again. I'm with the Egyptian scholar and historian, Dr. Charles S. Finch, tonight. We've been doing a lot of these Facebook Lives throughout the summer. We're doing them. We're going back to doing them, or we're going to start doing them about twice a month now, or every other week. But we do them typically on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. So we love to have as many of you join us as possible. But I'm about to turn it over to Dr. Finch so he can get started on the great Ethiopian queens.
Thank you very much, Rabia. First, it's important to know when we talk about Ethiopia what we're talking about, okay? Today, when we talk about Ethiopia, we're talking about a specific country on the Red Sea in Northeast Africa, all right? And that's our idea of Ethiopia. However, Ethiopia was a much larger geographical entity in antiquity. And actually, there were other names for it even before it took the name Ethiopia. Ethiopia is actually a Greek name, a Greek word. It means land of the sunburnt faces. Land of the sunburnt faces, because this is how the Greeks perceived the people who they called the Ethiopians, all right? And it was more than just what we today call Ethiopia. When the ancients talked about Ethiopia, it included parts of what is now Upper Egypt, the Sudan, Ethiopia today, and Saudi Arabia, as well as Libya. Let's not forget Libya. So it was a much greater extent. And Ethiopia had a certain legendary character, you might say, certainly among the Greeks. Now, we're talking about the great queens of Ethiopia, and we want to start perhaps with a little bit of the great mythological figures, great female mythological figures of Ethiopia. One of whom would be Andromeda. Now, Andromeda is was the daughter of Cepheus. We mentioned Cepheus before because Cepheus is a constellation that circles around the North Pole, and it will take its place at the North Pole of the magnetic North Pole in about 31 years, and it will rule there for 3,700 years. That's Cepheus, the Ethiopian king. His daughter is Andromeda, and that's who we'll focus on. Okay, Andromeda is always represented, at least in ancient times. I'm not talking about modern times, ancient times, as black skin, and she was famous for, mythologically, she was famous for being rescued by Perseus, because she was, she was chained to a rock so that a sea monster could come and claim her. And there was a reason for that. But Perseus came and killed the monster and claimed Andromeda, all right? And she is actually very close to her father out, in the heavens, so to speak. And so she is one who is very well known. The other one is called Medea. And Medea's father was Aeetes, and Medea and her people were Colchians. Now, the Colchians were described by Herodotus as black-skinned and woolly-haired. So you say, well, that must be Africa. No. Colchis was in what is now, Turkey, all right? Where black people were situated, both nationally and ethnically, was beyond what we think of as continental Africa. In any case, Medea was a magician, and she helped. She was not. Perseus. I already talked about Perseus. Anyway, sorry. She was another famous mythological personage who was of Ethiopian origin and was known by the Greeks as such. Now, historically, when we start talking about historically, the first known or the first famous Ethiopian queen known to history was Makeda. Makeda was queen of what is now called Saba or Sheba, all right? She was the queen of Sheba, all right? And she inherited the throne from her father. And she ruled over, as I say, Ethiopia, that stretched from what is now Ethiopia all the way across Yemen and into Arabia, Syria, northward into what we think of as Libya, even into southern Egypt. She reigned for 50 years. And she had established trade relationships with Solomon. And of course, there's a famous story in the Bible about how she got curious about Solomon because his reputation and his fame began to spread beyond Israel. And there is a story that she went to visit him with her entourage, her vast entourage. And of course, she was welcomed with all due honors as a visiting monarch. In fact, as a visiting monarch, because she ruled a country larger and far more powerful than Israel was at this time. That was about 1000 BC, okay, 1005 BC. And there's, of course, a story that she and Solomon became enamored with one another to such an extent that they actually produced a child, a son, by the name of Menelik, all right? Menelik went back to Ethiopia with his mother, and the Ethiopians today claim descent from that same Menelik. All right, Menelik, and that's a 3,000-year history. That's the thing about Ethiopia all the way up into the time of Haile Selassie, to the end of Haile Selassie. It was a 3,000-year dynasty, the longest dynasty in history anywhere. Wow. And even now, Menelik is an important name in Ethiopian history, and the Ethiopian royalty traced their origins back to Menelik, who was the son of Solomon and Makeda, or Solomon and Sheba. And so the Ethiopians, therefore, claim Solomon as one of their ancestors or one of their ancient kings, you might say, ancient rulers, through Makeda. And Makeda ruled the Queen of Sheba. Remember, Sheba, as I said, would have been not only what we think of as Ethiopia, but also what we think of as Saudi Arabia and Yemen, all right? Now, Saudi Arabia and Yemen back then the people didn't look like what they look like now. They were Ethiopian looking, okay? We could spend a lot of time talking about that. They were fundamentally Ethiopians. And Ethiopia, that was part of Ethiopia. That was considered, in fact, Eastern Ethiopia, all right? So Makeda was famous in history as the Queen of Sheba. And especially that interlude, as it were, between her and Solomon that produced Menelik, that started a 3,000-year dynasty. They call it the Solomonic dynasty in Ethiopia. Now, let's kind of go forward from there. Let's even go into what we call Cush, because back in the time we're talking about, there was no name Ethiopia given to Ethiopia. That was later. The Greeks gave what we call Ethiopia that name. It was called Cush, or Kesh, all right? And Cush would encompass what is mostly now thought of as the northern Sudan and parts of Ethiopia. Now, Cush is important at very important times in the history of Northeast Africa. Ancient Egyptians came from Cush. Mm-hmm. They're originally Cushites, okay? They came from the south, all right? And Cush established its own kingdom, several times. One was in 3000 BC, and the other one was about 800 BC, all right? Anyway, Cush is what we think of when we think of what became Ethiopia. Now, during what they call the 25th dynasty, or right before the 25th dynasty, Egypt itself was in a bad state of decline and chaos. Now, there was such a close nexus between Cush and Egypt, that they were, I don't know how you would put it. In other words, it was kind of like England and Scotland, if you will. All right, that's the closest I can come as an analogy. And so when Egypt started to decline and disintegrate, the Ethiopians, what we call the Cushites, came from the south under Pianke northward to restore order in Egypt. And that wasn't the first time that happened. That was about the third time that when Egypt was under tremendous internal collapse, that it was out of the south that a pharaoh or a king would come in and restore order and reestablish the civilization. Pianke, from again what we think of as Cush or Ethiopia, the northern Sudan, did the same thing. And by that time, the most important, after the king, the most important individuals in Cush were his sisters or his mother.
Queen Mother.
The Queen Mother. The Queen Mother, it was a very, very, very important position. It was second only to the pharaohs, the Nubian pharaohs. And that was true even of Egypt, okay? And that's true, you find that in a lot of African countries historically. The Queen Mother rules almost side by side with the king or the ruler,
Yes.
and in some ways has a lot of, shall we say, ritual power. Okay, well, that was, you could definitely see this in the 25th dynasty with Ethiopia, with Cush, which had to come from the south to reestablish order and the civilization of Egypt, and that was the fabled 25th dynasty. Now, what Pianki did, he established his sisters as the chief priestesses of Amun. Now, that's like the Pope of ancient Egypt. Chief priest of Amun was like the Egyptian Pope, the most important sacerdotal position in all of ancient Egypt. And he put his sisters in that position, okay? And of course, his wife, I forget her name, she remained behind in Ethiopia, and she kind of held the kingdom together. Now, the names of those the sisters, they ruled one after the other. The first one was called Amanirenas, okay? The second one was called Sheba. And they were the chief priestesses of Amun. They were the pope, they were the female popes of ancient Egypt, all right? Now, what happened with Ethiopia, unfortunately, is that they were eventually conquered and driven out by the Assyrians. And then the Persians take over. But interestingly enough,
and that was in Ethiopia?
No. I'm
Not
sorry.
In Egypt.
No, this is in Egypt. Sorry,
Okay,
I'm
Egypt.
sorry if I'm if I'm confusing that, because now we're still talking about 25th dynasty that got conquered by the Assyrians and eventually led to the 26th dynasty. Mm-hmm. But they never removed Sheba from her position as the Pope. I'm using that word Pope, as the chief priestess of Amun. They left her alone. They left her right in place. Okay. Now, so this was a situation as you found it in ancient Egypt. And we're talking about 8th century BC, around somewhere about 715 to 715 BC. Now, but back in Ethiopia or Cush, the intense, what I want to call matriarchal construct of the society and of the rulership was not only in place, but it became intensified, as it were. The Queen Mother became ever more powerful, all right? And she had a name, her title was Kandaki. And Kandaki meant Queen Mother. But it wasn't just a ceremonial position. As I've already said, it was a very powerful, important position, all right? The Kandaki. And the Romans later on called them the Candaces. Mm-hmm. Because after the kings from about the 7th century on of Cush or Ethiopia were always had their mothers as their second most important powerful people in the kingdom. So the Queen Mothers kind of co-ruled. Then there came a time, however, when at least 5 Candaces, that's what the Romans call them, Candaces, Candace. Instead of Kentucky, the Romans turned the name into Candace. And we all know individuals who are named Candace. Well, that's where that comes from. Candace was the name of an Ethiopian, was a great Queen Mother, Ethiopian queen. But she began, 5 of them ruled alone. I mean, when I say ruled in their own right. 5 of them, okay? All the way up until the end of that phase of Ethiopian history, about 300 BC. No, excuse me, 300 AD. Now, what was interesting, though, is that Romans conquer. What happened was, who met them? Right there at the border, right when they tried to cross the border into Ethiopia. It was a Candace at the head of her army. That, that's the thing about African queens. They didn't just sit back at the palace on their thrones. They were active rulers. They were rulers in every sense of the word, and they were generals. They would go out in front with their armies, at the head of their armies, against any enemy. And when the Romans came down to Upper Egypt and were crossing the border, who did they meet? They met Candace. Mm-hmm. Now, Candace destroyed the Roman garrison in Upper Egypt. Now, I'm not saying she won the war, because the Romans came back and it went back and forth. But the Kandaki fought the Romans, and it basically a standstill. Now, they had to retreat because the Roman power was supreme at that time, but the Romans didn't follow her. Yeah. They didn't follow to Napata. Napata was the capital of Ethiopia at that time. They didn't try to go down that far because they knew that they would never come back. Because you see, you got to understand what the topography of Ethiopia and Egypt was. It was desert, and you had to know the desert and know how to fight in the desert. And the Romans didn't know how. They could come down to Upper Egypt, and that was about as far as they could go. Upper Egypt being the south, by the way. It's worth digressing to say, for the Egyptians, up was south, down was north. Mm-hmm. Why? Because of where the Nile come from. The Nile came from the south. Okay, so everything that connoted first, chief, and upper was southern. In fact, the Egyptians themselves came from the south. All right. So when we talk about Upper Egypt, we're talking about southern Egypt. All right. So the Romans came, they met Candace, and Candace fought them basically to a standstill. And I can't say she defeated them as such, but the Romans thought better of trying to pursue her into into Ethiopia, down to her capital, and kind of backed away and just contented themselves with dominating Egypt. All right, and that's kind of what they did. Those Candaces, therefore, are very, very inspiring historical figures. All right, when we start talking about the great queens of Egypt and Ethiopia. By the way, let me kind of backtrack a little bit, because there were a couple of other great queens of Egypt who were of Ethiopian extraction. And I kind of glossed over them, but it's worth mentioning them, at least two of them. One was called Amanishakhete. Why mention her? Because she was the founding ancestress of the 18th dynasty. The 18th dynasty was considered the most, the most glorious dynasty of any country anywhere. And she was the founder. Now, she didn't rule by herself, but she kind of overshadowed her husband, because she was such a powerful, dynamic figure. And afterwards, Egyptians always had a reverence and a reference to her. Amanishakhete. In fact, I think eventually she was deified. Okay.
And I know also that she was deified partly because of her black skin.
Black skin. She was definitely black skin.
They idolized the blue black color.
Well, I mean, because Kemet.
Yeah.
The name Kemet means the black land, and the people are Kemiu, which means the black people. You see, we don't have to get into this argument about whether these are black people or not. That's a false argument and always have been. You talk about fake news. That's fake history. All right, we can talk about that at another time if we wanted to. But the other one, one of the most extraordinary individuals in all of history, was Hatshepsut.
Oh yes.
Now Hatshepsut. Again, now this goes back to the 18th dynasty
of Egypt.
Now we're in Egypt, but she ruled as pharaoh for 20 years, not as king. Not as queen, as pharaoh.
Yeah. As a male.
Yes, she used to. She had. She was married to a king. The Tutmosis III, and she had children. But when she was ruling alone, or in her own right, she used to wear a false beard, because she was ruling as pharaoh. There were actually 4 female pharaohs in the 4,000 year history of Egypt, and she is the most famous and the most dynamic and the most powerful one. She is the one that left her greatest imprint on the history of Egypt at that time and in subsequent history. The problem is, she stood in the way of the man who would become the most powerful king in all of Egyptian history, Tutmosis III, and she was his aunt, and he hated her because she was so strong, so dynamic. He saw her as keeping him from the throne.
And she did.
Yeah, and she did.
Because, he was supposed to.
Yeah, but, he hated her, but he was not able to overcome her rule for 20 years. And we don't know what happened to her. What I think happened is that when he was finally strong enough to assert his place and position, I think he just exiled her. Because she just kind of disappears from history. One thing you didn't do, you didn't do what they call regicide on somebody, because especially a woman, especially the queen. Because see, that's what I haven't said also. The rulership in Egypt, as an Ethiopian, came down through what? The women. In other words, if you were going to be pharaoh, you could be anybody in the royal family, but you had to be married to the great royal wife presumptive, because the kingship, the rulership, the throne came down through the women. The women were sacrosanct in that way. All right, and you see that in other parts of Africa, by the way. But so even if the pharaoh was the ruler, he ruled by virtue of his marriage to the great royal wife presumptive, and she was a line of queens that had come down, and you had to marry her, okay? And Hatshepsut would have been one of those. And she just was so powerful, strong, dynamic, she kind of pushed, I guess you might say, asserted herself up to the pharaonic position. So Tutmosis, though he hated her with a passion, he couldn't execute her.
It'd be worse saying her father groomed her for that.
Yeah,
position,
yes,
though.
he did.
It wasn't just she just got out of her place or anything like that. All of Egypt went along with this. The priests supported her. Her father was already grooming her to be the pharaoh, to replace him.
Why? Because she was showed herself a woman of extraordinary ability. She was beyond a genius. She was, I don't know, what other word can we I had nothing, ever since I learned about Hatshepsut, she's been one of my favorite persons in Egyptian history. And she was more dynamic, more powerful than anybody else who could have possibly ascended to the throne. And her father, you're right, he's right, she was her father's favorite in every way, both personally as well as follow him to the throne. Hatshepsut, it's a name worth remembering. And Amanishakhete was one of her ancestors.
Yes. She descended from from Amos, so the people who wrested from the Hyksos, Egypt back from the Hyksos.
Oh,
so she has a glorious ancestry.
You see,
right?
I
love that dynasty.
We could spend a year following up on what Rabia is alluding to here, so I'm just trying to focus on the great queens of Ethiopia. So I'm not filling in everything that could be filled in, but when we come to among my favorite historical individuals in ancient Egypt, one is Amanishakhete. She was beautiful too, by the way, and the other is Hatshepsut. All right, so those are names that one should remember, and one should read about them and study them. All right, because they are, shall we say, paragons of African queenhood. Can I use that term?
Turinda would like for you to spell her name. Just
which one? Who?
Hatshepsut.
Yeah, I got to see if I got. Let me get this right.
H-A-T.
Let's see, Hatshepsut.
Almost like it sounds.
Hatshepsut. Did you get that? Hatshepsut.
Yes.
Amanishakhete is Ahmes, or sometimes Oose. Nefertari, Fnertari. Nefer means beautiful. Ari means to dwell in.
Yes,
so
that's right.
and that means to dwell in beauty. Okay. Anyway, you can go online now. You can find both of those individuals online. All right, and they're worth looking. They're worth learning about. And so, and they're of Ethiopian ancestry too, by the way. Yes. One of the things I wanted to be sure to remember to mention, but I haven't so far. Most of the let me see. Many of the pharaohs, you had the great royal wife, okay, there was that. But if there are other queens, Nubian.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, Nubian. That's why, that's why there was such this nexus, if you might say, this close connection between. It was family, yeah.
They're just a family.
And most of their other wives, in fact, the great royal wives, were of Nubian ancestry as well. We call them Nubians. By the way, that word Nubian is late.
Yeah, we got Nubian, Ethiopian, Kushite. They're interchangeable almost.
Thank you. Nubian is actually a word that comes from Egyptian word meaning gold, Nub. And of course, Nubia was a land of gold. They just, some people said that the Nubians just seemed to be could walk on gold because there was so much gold there, at least in the minds of the people of antiquity. So they called it Nubia, but that was late. That was Roman times. Before, it was Ethiopia, it was Cush. Those were the names, and Ethiopia is even late. That's a Greek word meaning, as I say, land of the sunbird. Before that, it would be Cush, and but as I say, even the name Ethiopian encompass is far more than what Ethiopia is today. And we've already talked about that. So Cush was the ancient name of what we today call Ethiopia.
Are there any other names? We'll fast forward a little bit back to the Candaces.
Yeah.
Do you know any of the other names of any of the Candaces? We said Amirdas.
Amanirenas.
Shepanupet.
Shanakdakh. I'm surprised I even remember that. Shanakdakh was another one. And there's two others whose names do escape me. Sorry.
So if we always we're always excited for you in our Facebook community to help fill us in when we blank out on names and things. So if you know names, certainly feel free to post that.
Now let me just say this, because some people might say, "Well, why study Egypt?" Okay, I want
Egypt or Ethiopia.
Well, either in a way, it almost doesn't matter to me, because back then, as I say, the connection, the nexus was so close that there were distinctions without a difference. But let's say Ethiopia, Egypt as a hyphenated word.
The Nile Valley.
All of your major ethnic groups, from I think I said this before in a previous discussion, from the Senegal River in the north to the Congo River in the south, all of them can trace their origins back to the Nile Valley. Every one of them. And I remember. I know I mentioned this. There were 5 migrations that were impelled westward out of Egypt because of foreign invasions, and they all crossed the Sahara before it was completely a desert, and would settle in that strip of West Africa, as I say, from the the Senegal River in the north to the Congolese River in the south. And I said this before in a previous broadcast. Well, where did African Americans come from? 90% of them. The same strip of land, West Africa. And so, there is basically you want to call it a blood tie of African Americans. It takes us all the way back to the Nile Valley. So this is not this is not just an intellectual exercise. History is not an intellectual exercise, especially for African Americans. It's a reconstruction and a resurrection exercise.
Resurrection.
That's why I've been fascinated by history all my life. It's a resurrection exercise. And you see, other African peoples, other peoples.
Go ahead.
The only time you ever hear, let me get my words straight. You will sometimes even now hear, well, what's the point of us studying all this history? What good is it for us? There is no other people in the world who ever ask that question. Only black people in America ask that question. Anything you hope to be, plan to be, have a vision of being, has to be based on a conception of your history. For as far back as you can go. And we can go back 300,000 years, but we're not going to talk about that. It has to be there. It's a foundation without which there is no future. Okay? So if you can't possibly meet the challenges of the current times we're in, let alone the future, until you have started, not only immersing yourself, but grounding yourself in a full sense of history.
Absolutely. So relevant for Afrofuturism, for all you who are familiar with that concept.
So, anyway, but as I say, I have been studying history ever since I was 6 years old. of one kind or another. Not just Black history.
World.
That's my other thing. I want to just drop before we finish. Study everybody's history to the extent that you can, because it's in one way or the other, it reflects back on you. And so, if we follow our logic from everything we've been saying in all of our webcasts, where does all history come from anyway? All history where does it come from anyway? So I am interested in history in the general sense, with a specific focus and a concentration, preoccupation, you might say, of the history of people of African descent. But I don't just limit myself, and nobody should. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So,
were there any other queens that you wanted to mention? Getting closer to the end.
Let me think. There's the Falasha queen Judith. Falasha were the Ethiopian Jews, and she was queen of the Ethiopian Jews who conquered Ethiopia in the 13th century A.D.
A.D.
And ruled for 40 years.
Like 700 years.
Yeah, 40 years. That was her name was Judith. The one that people are more likely to have heard about is Yasentewa, who was the Akan Ashanti queen, who rallied her people against the British invasion that eventually led to the conquest of what we today call Ghana. Yasentewa is another one.
I like when you bring up that they rallied against the British, because people tend to think that the Africans just laid down and were conquered.
No.
And we just aren't learning that part of our history, that how much we fought, how many battles we won, how long this war was. I mean, we have a long history with rebellion and with standing up for ourselves and fighting to the death for our people and for our land, for our religion, for our culture.
And the thing about Yasentewa is that the male leaders and rulers of the Akan people, they kind of wanted to throw in the towel, wave the white flag. She said, oh no, we are a proud people. We are not just going to roll over and play dead. We are going to fight for our country and for our people. And now they didn't win, of course, but she wasn't going to just let them roll over her and her people.
I think that matters to African Americans if we knew that. I think we all understand we didn't win that war, but to know how much they fought, and especially our queens.
Yeah.
How even when the men were just like, oh, we can't win this war, the queens and the matriarchs were like, no, we're not going. No, we're fighting to the end. And that was definitely Yasentewa. Okay, yeah. And we Candace basically did the same thing, of course, back in Roman times. All right. So this is a long history. It's just a long history, absolutely, of that strength of the African woman, for sure. And
we're just kind of what do you want to say? Touching the highlights. This is a deep, long, extensive history that would repay anybody's study.
So we're going to kind of wrap up from there, but I do want to make these points that, these facts and these historical facts that Dr. Finch and many like him have to share with us have so much implication for us as African Americans, for Africans of diaspora, and for Africans, period. It has so much implication, so much power for all of us and for our young people. I mean, I just don't feel like we know this. We don't teach this history enough.
Oh, no.
It is so empowering to know it from our own mouths, not from a Eurocentric interpretation of our history, but from our own mouths, from our reinterpreting it for ourselves, because we know what we need to hear. And so this is part of the work that we're doing, where we have Dr. Finch coming in speaking live with you all, and we hope that you guys will share this information. We're going to be uploading all of these live videos on YouTube in our archives. Just bear with us as we get them all uploaded, because we actually are editing some of them as well. So again, Dr. Finch has over 30 years of lecturing, of teaching, of writing books, I don't question any of his knowledge. I would hope that
You
no one does, because he's so thorough.
Yeah, well, you should question. And
you
then,
can, yes,
but
he's so
if you're going to
thorough.
question, then go back and study yourself. Find out whether there's anything to question. Don't just question it and not have anything to question it with. You understand what I'm saying?
And his knowledge is so encyclopedic. I keep saying that because, I mean, he wows even academians. They have a hard time debating with him because he just knows so much. And so I'm just so honored to bring him here for anyone, whether they've ever heard Dr. Finch speak or not before. I'm just so happy that to have this opportunity to do this. Again, we will be back in 2 weeks on Tuesday at 7 p.m. So not next Tuesday, but the Tuesday after that. And we'll be coming up with a topic before then. So if you enjoy these live, because we try to interact with you as well, if you have questions, please be back on Tuesday at 7 p.m. We're going to post it so you can share it. And also we will upload. He has a channel, Charles S. Finch channel on YouTube. Tune in. There he goes back all the way into the 80s from the lectures and the presentations that he's done. As well, his website, charlessfinch.com, where we try to make a livelihood for him, so that he can retire and just sit back and just generate and just give you guys the information, not have to work in addition. So we want to support Dr. Finch. We want to support him, and that's why I'm working hard so that my dad his legacy can really, really live on and multiply, amongst
So blacks. The great Queens of Ethiopia, that's just shall we say, an introduction to the manner in which black women has sustained African history, black history, whatever you want to call it, over thousands of years. And we just introduced a subject.
Yeah.
And sometimes, black women got left out of the historical record.
Yeah.
Up until very recently. Well, that's changing.
Yeah. So we're going to be a part of that change. Absolutely. So anyway, thank you all so much for tuning in. I wish you a very wonderful evening. And hope to see you back here in 2 weeks.